Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here. Before I got here, I asked around in my department at Northwestern, has anyone ever addressed the American Philosophical Society? And the one person who said yes was my colleague Joel Mokyr, and he just won the Nobel Prize in Economics. So now I'm feeling very good about my future, so thank you. So I am a historian of early modern Japan, which we define as the era between 1600 and 1868. And I've always been interested in ordinary women and also everyday life. And even though women's history, social history, gender history are well-established fields by now, it can still be a very challenging area of research. And this is especially true if you're writing for a popular audience. So it's long been the conventional wisdom in my field, Japanese history, that there's no audience for a popular book about Japanese history that doesn't somehow feature white men or World War II or preferably both. Happily, this turns out not to be true, but there are other issues. Some subjects are more difficult than others. If you're writing about, say, Ben Franklin, to take a totally random example, you'll probably find that he wrote so much and other people wrote so much about him that you have enough material to illuminate his character and his motivations. But with ordinary people who didn't leave an extensive documentary record, you can end up with a central figure who was real but who doesn't seem real on the page. And this kind of imbalance is inherent in historical methodology because we can't actually make things up. And yet, if you have more evidence, you will have a more complete picture. So what do you do when you feel like you don't have enough? And my answer to that, which I'm going to be speaking about today, is to pay attention to the form of evidence, as well as its context, to pay attention to very small details and gaps. And this strategy kind of leads in the opposite direction from a lot of the talks we've probably heard, which are about the immense capacity of new technology to skim and sort and detect patterns. But sometimes, as I'm going to argue, huge gaps can be bridged by very, very, very tiny details on a human scale. So, my talk is about an obscure woman named Tsuneno and her world in early modern Japan. But it's also about method. It's about how you assemble a story from scraps. To borrow a metaphor from my subject's work with textiles, I tried to write my book so the seams didn't show, but in this talk, I'm going to turn the narrative inside out to give you a glimpse of some of the messiness underneath. I first met my protagonist, Tsuneno, in 2009, and I was starting out as an assistant professor at Northwestern, and for the first time, I was assigned to teach a lecture class to undergraduates about Japan in the early modern period, and I was really excited. But as I was looking around for course materials to assign to the students, I realized there wasn't very much about everyday life. So I was looking around on the internet, Googling, as one does, and I came across the homepage of the Niigata Prefectural Archives, which is a public archive in Japan. Niigata Prefecture is like the Japanese equivalent of an American state. And on this website, they had something called the Internet Document Reading Course, which is where they introduced some of the documents in their collection to the public as part of the public mission of saying, this is what we have, come to the archive and see it. And number 13 in this series caught my attention, and this is what it looked like. Now, at the time, in 2009, I couldn't read any of this at all. But luckily, there was a transcription which I could read. And from that, I produced a translation, which you can see here. And it was a letter. It was a letter from a woman who was writing home to her mother. My mother's actually in the audience. She was writing home to her mother from the big city of Edo, which is now Tokyo. And she wrote, I'm writing with spring greetings. As you know, I went to Kanda Minagawa-cho in Edo quite unexpectedly, and I ended up in so much trouble. The letter went on in a style that was shockingly vivid and almost contemporary. Everything I eat is delicious, she wrote. And she sounded exactly like me writing emails home from my first trip to Tokyo in 1997. Everything there really is delicious. So the archive provided a brief synopsis of her life, and revealed that it contained dozens of letters to and from and about her in the archive, and I thought, great. So I visited the archive as soon as I could, and I spent days there taking pictures of hundreds of documents. And Edo period letters in particular They're folded accordion style, and they can be literally very long. They can take up the width of an entire archive table. And it turned out that these letters weren't the only things that were relevant. So there were also letters to and from her brothers. There was also amazingly outgoing correspondence, which historians love, because usually people get their incoming correspondence. They don't keep drafts of what they sent. These people did. And these drafts that I'm showing you were scribbled on the back of some sketches of samurai, which you can see there on the right side. There were also envelopes, because people in this period didn't buy ready-made envelopes. They made their own envelopes out of paper. These are often cataloged separately. And then there are documents that aren't letters or envelopes at all. There are things like household diaries and also inventories of the stuff that they had. The problem was that back in 2009, I couldn't read any of this. I had no idea what any of this said. It all looked like squiggles to me. And I thought to myself, as I was standing there at the archive table, I'm wasting my time, and even worse than that, I'm wasting my research money. But I'd gone all the way there, so I just stood in the archive taking photo after photo, feeling kind of helpless about the whole thing. Now, eventually, I did learn to read these documents, and it entailed destroying my manuscript dictionary, which you can see there with a picture of my dog. And I'm telling this story partly as background about how I encountered my subject, but also as an illustration of the materiality of the sources that I used. And from those sources, I could assemble the outline of a story. Tsuneno was a Buddhist priest's daughter, born in 1804 in Ishigami village in Echigo province, which you can see in this map here of Kubiki County. When she was only 12, she was married to another Buddhist priest way up north in Dewa province. His temple was in the river town of Oishida, and amazingly, I went there. This temple is still standing, and this is the original graveyard and bell and the storehouse. Tsuneno lived here for about 15 years, but her marriage ultimately collapsed, and she was sent home. After 2 more disastrous marriages back home in Echigo, her older brother planned to marry her off for a 4th time. But Tsuneno, who was in her mid-30s and had already been through 3 failed marriages, decided she would rather die, she said, than marry some widower in some terrible place. Instead, she pawned her clothes and she ran away to the big city of Edo, where she lived in a back alley tenement and found work as a maidservant. She married again, this time to a man of her choosing. He was a fellow migrant, a peasant from the village right next to hers in Echigo, and he had gone to the city to reinvent himself as a masterless samurai. After that marriage, she lived a very colorful life in Edo, living in poverty most of the time, before her husband got a position in service to a very famous Edo city magistrate, kind of like the town governor. This guy was Toyama Kinshiro. There he is. He's famous because there's so many Japanese TV series about this guy. So that's not a portrait of him, that's from the TV series. And the reason we know that she worked for him is because of the envelopes. So those are the envelopes, and they have his address on them. They're to Tsuneno in the residence of the city magistrate. Tsuneno died in 1853, just before Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in Edo Bay to quote-unquote open Japan. But what I just told you is the outline of a story. It's a series of plot points. It's not the story itself. It can kind of mechanically show you that social and physical mobility were possible for women in this era, but it doesn't give you any texture and it has no life. And if what I wanted in my work was to create a sense of who these people were, what their world was like, the problems they faced, and how they decided to solve them, it wasn't enough. So I could find more by turning to the form of the documents. So for example, here is one of Tsuneno's letters home from her family's collection, the Rinsenji Monjo. I want you to look at the form of the document and her handwriting, and then to notice that Tsuneno, as a woman, wrote in a very different style from her brothers. Her brothers wrote blocky Chinese characters. She wrote in the phonetic script in a much more flowing hand. And the difference between women's handwriting and men's handwriting is important, because I'm going to tell you next about the best archival discovery I made while writing. So to explain this, I have to tell you that for years, 10 years I spent writing this book, I had no idea when my protagonist Tsuneno was born. I got used to the idea that I'd never know and I wouldn't have a good starting date for the book. But when I finally finished my first draft, I went back to the Niigata archive, and I called up a document I'd never looked at before, which is cataloged as the record of Tsuneno's older brother Gyu's birth. This is what it looked like. It's a typical document in men's handwriting. And I flipped through it, noting all the gifts that arrived for Tsuneno's brother's birth. And then I stopped short because the last pages looked quite different. This is a woman's handwriting. And what it says is, 3rd month, 12th day, Tsuneno's birth. So I was amazed by this, right? Finally, I know when this woman was born, but it's important not only as a confirmation of the date, but because what this arrangement of information in a book means. Tsuneno's older brother's birth was the important one. The record of it was written by a man. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. Her birth record is stuffed in the back of this book as an afterthought, and it's much, much shorter. And that informed how I wrote the description of Tsuneno's birth in the book, which tells you about the difference between how many presents he got and what an event it was, and also what a woman's birth in this period as a later-born child would have been like. Another example of form comes from a different kind of document written by another member of Tsuneno's family. This is actually a document with no name on it. It only has a title, Nairan Ichijo. That means a record of family disturbance. Now, from piecing together the context, I could finally find out that the author must have been her older brother, whose birth record we just saw. And by the time this was composed, he was the head of the family and head priest of the temple. He signed his name on everything else he wrote, but not on this. So already there's something unsettling about this document. This is a paraphrase of what it says. After the wedding, my wife and I passed a month peacefully, and then she went on the customary first visit back to her parents' home. But after she returned, her behavior changed suddenly and dramatically. She refused to obey any of my instructions. She pointedly ignored my lectures about Buddhist and Confucian morality. She neglected basic household tasks, and my little sisters complained to my mother. When I confronted her, she answered sullenly, "I'll do as I like, and you do as you like too. Get a prostitute or a concubine, I don't care." I was shocked. After consulting with my uncle, I decided I had to divorce her, even though I was reluctant on several counts. An early divorce was embarrassing. My family had just spent a fortune on the wedding, and also it seemed as if she might be pregnant. But resolved, I confronted her, and I told her that I was ending the marriage. She began to cry so hard she could barely speak, but she managed to choke out a startling confession. In the 5th month, just after we were married, when she was lying sick in bed, a man broke into her room and raped her. After she told this story, she refused to eat for 2 days. She sobbed and begged my forgiveness. The following spring, I sent her home to give birth, but I didn't ask her to come back. When her family sent inquiries, I told them that things had not worked out, and eventually I sent a notice of divorce. Now, this story is obviously incomplete on its own terms. There are important and obvious silences. For example, who was the perpetrator? Why didn't Gyu look for him? Did he even ask? And what about the pregnancy and the baby? Was it a boy or a girl? What happened to that child? In fact, the answers to those questions are hidden in very deliberate silences. About the baby, we only have to look at the dates. Gyu's wife was raped in the 5th month, and she gave birth roughly 9 months later, in the 2nd month of the next year. From his silence about and disinterest in the child, we can guess that he thought it was, or at least could have been, his wife's rapist child and not his. And who was the rapist? Well, here we have to turn to form. The information comes in a literal blank space in the story. That blank space is right here. After the space, there's a new page and a new mark, that horizontal mark at the top of the page that you can see there, Totsu, that designates a new story. But in this case, it's not a new story, because the sentence after that mark reads, About my younger brother Girin's misconduct in the 5th month of last year, nothing more needs to be said here. In other words, he didn't hunt for the rapist because he knew who it was. It was his younger brother. But he couldn't speak about it. He said nothing more needs to be said here. So he wrote this whole account, pages and pages, and then he deliberately indicated what he could not say. It's an amazing contradiction, and it tells you something about how the patriarchal family worked. And at the same time, it kind of tells you what it cost the patriarchs themselves, because Guillou wrote all of this and then indicated what he couldn't say. It seems to me that while his unnamed, unmourned first wife and child were victims, the pressures of performing his role as head of household, of keeping up appearances, took a toll on him too. So that's what the manuscript sources look like and the information of gender and power that can be hidden within them. But I also want to talk about sources other than letters. Because once I had all these letters, I had to build out to describe what the world looked like that Tsuneno lived in. So first, let's visit her home province in Echigo. Very early in the book, I describe her village, Ishigami Village, and I talk about this small temple in Echigo province at the foot of steep mountains in the heart of Japan's snow country. And then I describe what the village looked like, and I describe all the labor that peasants had to do to dig out of the snow. This paragraph relies on 3 sources. 2 of them are visual, and 1 of them is my experience. So most straightforward, those curving pathways and small canals come from maps in the same family collection as the documents. So you can literally see that Ishigami Village had curving pathways and small canals. The second source I used is a great illustrated book, Hokuetsu Seppu, which was published in 1837. This is a published source. It's not in the archive. It's a woodblock print. And its most famous pages are these that illustrate snowflakes. And this book became such a bestseller that people started printing snowflakes on their kimono. It was very popular. In any case, the point of this book was somewhat anthropological. It was a book written specifically to tell city people about what life was like in the snow country. And so some of the illustrations were meant to be explanatory. So that paragraph that I have about snowshoes and snow implements comes directly from the images in this book. But this was also a case where the source made me think more about the specific experience of living in the snow country and also how it related to my own experience. So seeing all those images of footwear and coats made me think about living in Chicago, which is also very snowy, and how every year I can't wear my own normal pretty shoes because I have to wear snow boots every day in the winter. And I thought this would be even more of a problem if my normal shoes were geta, which are like sandals. And so later on in the book, thinking about that, I wrote this sentence. After spending her entire life in Echigo, it was strange for Tsuneno to walk on muddy streets in her everyday sandals at a time of year when she would ordinarily need snowshoes. So that's partly evidence from images, partly evidence from experience, and that evidence from experience also comes out in another place in that original paragraph about Echigo, which is about the snow blowing across the rice fields and making it difficult to see. I know this because I went there on a research trip and I talked to people. And they told me in the winter, when the snow blows across the rice fields, it is difficult to see. And so that ended up in the book, even though it couldn't really end up in a footnote. So I'm going to conclude with the great city of Edo, which is the backdrop to most of this book. And it's where the visual record is really deep and fascinating. In some ways, it's the opposite of the situation in villages. For Edo period villages, not every village, but a lot of them, we have an extensive textual record. The village headman had to keep records, and there are still many families that have a pile of documents in a storeroom somewhere. The Rinsenji documents I mentioned are the tip of the iceberg, and there are hundreds more Tsunenos waiting to be discovered in Japanese storehouses and attics. But relative to its enormous size, probably 1.2 million in 1800, Edo doesn't have huge collections of manuscript materials, simply because this city burned so much, and also because people were much more transient, so they didn't stay in the same house forever. What we have to compensate is prints, paintings, maps, and all kinds of artistic representations. So one great and very well-known example is the Kidai Shoran, which is a scroll painting held in the Berlin Museum of Art. It depicts an Edo street scene. And as art historians know, you cannot take artistic representations at face value. But the great historian of Edo, Yoshida Nobuyuki, has done a lot of work on this scroll, and he has a fantastic book about it. And he and his collaborators have been able to verify that every store that's shown in this scroll, which is much longer than this image, has a corollary on a store that was actually there. So this was intended to be a faithful depiction of this street. And you can also see a lot of Edo types. This kind of looks like Where's Waldo? But there are street vendors and students going to school and samurai out on errands and servants carrying packages. These are all people who really existed in this city. You can look at this description of Nihonbashi Bridge, which is on the left side of the image, and then you can read my description of it, which is like climbing a small crowded hill, and you can understand where that comes from. Another great thing about the visual record of Edo is it's so voluminous. You can pinpoint a month and figure out what was going on in the city in that month. So when I wanted to describe what was happening in the new year, 1840, I could find which kabuki productions were playing by looking at the excellent collection of playbills from the MFA in Boston, and this is the playbill that I used. And then using that information, I could find corresponding prints like this one, which were meant to advertise the play. Now, interestingly, this actually does not show you what people wore on stage, but it does show you what people thought was fashionable and what they wanted to see in the new year of 1840. And using this print, I wrote about fashion. Well, these materials, playbills and prints, were up to the moment because they were meant to advertise and entertain. There is also a less ephemeral archive of useful information in Edo. And as a result, some of the most interesting and most accurate sources about what the city looked like and felt like aren't ukiyo-e prints and paintings, but less visually striking materials like maps. And these are useful in all kinds of ways. So for one thing, I found a printed map of Edo in Tsuneno's family's collection. And that was evidence of the provincial family's interest in and engagement with the city. The same was true of her brother's hand-drawn map of the Edo Theater District, which I also found in their collection. This is a family that's interested in what's going on in the city, even though they live hundreds of miles away. And other types of maps are useful in writing descriptions. So for example, what did a back alley look like? Tsuneno lived in a place called Minagawa-cho, which I'm going to show you in a minute. What was it like to live in a tenement in Minagawa-cho? Well, we don't have a map of Minagawa-cho, but we do have a map of the cho, the block, right next door. And it shows you, this is a property ownership map, and it shows the value of the property and also the layout of the back alleys. And it will even show you where the well was, that's in the circle, where the trash box was, the rectangle, and also where the latrines were. So you can get a good kind of idea of what it was like to move through these spaces. Those maps I used to get a sense of layout. Others I used to orient myself so I could see the city through her eyes. So for example, you can compare a printed map of the city in its entirety to these little segmented maps of neighborhoods called kiriezu. And so by looking at the kiriezu, I could see what Tsuneno's path looked like as she walked into the city, and I could note all of the different things that she could have seen along the way because they're clearly indicated on the map. These maps of neighborhoods also show how people conceived of the city. When Tsuneno first arrived, she wrote, as I showed you in that very first letter, that she lived in Minagawa-cho in Kanda, which is a commoner neighborhood. Also, she got a job working for a high-ranking samurai named Matsudaira Tomosaburo. Those were just words on a page to me. I knew Kanda, commoner neighborhood. Matsudaira Tomosaburo is not a famous person. But here's Minagawa-cho on the Kanda neighborhood map. And there is the residence of this guy, Matsudaira Tomosaburo, marked on a different neighborhood map of Surugadai. That's the samurai neighborhood. Edo people conceived these as different places that needed two different maps, but if you put them together, you notice that they're actually only steps away from each other, which makes sense that she lived there and that she worked in this samurai's residence that was basically in her neighborhood. So these neighborhoods could be right next to each other, but in other ways conceived of as worlds apart. And so in the book I wrote, every morning, Tsuneno went out through the tenement gate, walked the short distance into a samurai district, and entered yet another of Edo's many new worlds. So, I hope that gives you some sense of what it was like for me to enter Tsuneno's world, and also some sense of the ways that I could turn to these ideas about form and image and space to make sense of and to tell her story. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for that absolutely spellbinding and vivid description of Tsuneno's life. For those of you who know anything about Japanese archives, this is just best. This is just beautiful practice, and it shows not only what Japanese archives, but archives like the APS can yield when good detectives are working on them. So thank you very much, Amy. We have time for one brief question. Yes, can we get a mic? Please state your name and where you are from.
Lothar von Falkenhausen from UCLA. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Two things elicit my curiosity here. For one thing, how common was it for a person of Tsuneno's origin in her period to be able to read and to write with such fluency? And secondly, in a society where mobility was as restricted as we usually think it was in Edo period Japan, how was she able, and how was her brother able, to explore Edo like that? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two really good questions. Somebody of Tsuneno's status had to be able to write because she was going to go be the bride at a Buddhist temple. And because of that kind of important standing in the community, cultured women were expected to be able to, say, keep up correspondence, to know, for example, by reading about etiquette, what do you serve at a dinner party, things like that. What is the arrangement of things on a plate? How do you put clothes together? And all of those things were in the archive of useful information. So she had to be able to read. She had to be able to write. There are no women of her class who would not have been able to do that in her generation in the 19th century. The question about mobility is also very good because we have this idea that the samurai authorities really restricted mobility. That is not precisely true. Like a lot of things in the Edo period, it is more of a kind of facade than a fact. It was harder for women to travel. The shogunate was very attentive to the idea that people might want to ship women out of Edo so that they could then attack it. But men had more unrestricted mobility, and women, if they knew how to get around the checkpoints, could come and go as they pleased. And her family actually hired an express service to serve as an escort for her when she came back from Edo to avoid these problems, so people knew how to get around it.
Great. Thank you again, Amy. Let's give her a hand.